we all know that it's not always sunny in Amsterdam, and despite the great weather, you chose to be here, so that's very good to see. My name is Josip Kesic, Head of Academic Affairs here at NIAS. And I would like to welcome you all, NIAS fellows, all the guests, and especially Wayne and De Brake. To the seminar organized not only by NIAS, but also by the Amsterdam Center for the Study of the Golden Age. So we're happy for that collaboration. There are multiple links between this place and De Brake, who is a professor emeritus of history at Purchase College, State University of New York. The first link is he was a NIAS fellow in the year 1991. The second link is he returned to NIAS as a NIAS fellow 10 years later, in the year 2000. And another link is the following one. When this building housed the Amsterdam School for Social Science Research, ASR, De Brake was invited by the Dutch sociologist Bram de Zwaan, and his office, he told me, was two floors beneath us, where he would listen often to the church organ of the Waalse Kerk, which is the building next to us. And with such daily inspiration, it's not a surprise that your period in Amsterdam was so productive. Exactly. It's not a coincidence, I think. So in other words, for us actually, the conclusion is that De Brake is a NIAS recidivist, or in Dutch we could say, draaider NIASist. De Brake has been working on the theme of religious differences in early modern Europe for decades now, and has become a prominent voice in this field, where other scholars working on the same period mainly focused on religious difference, violence, conflict. He focused rather on coexistence and peace. There are many books he wrote, I will just mention the latest. Religious War and Religious Peace in Early Modern Europe, published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. The topic of accommodating religious differences resonates with the NIAS mission, as we at NIAS seek to provide a safe haven for curiosity-driven research, where the notion of interdisciplinarity is very important. So in our case, also, differences are not something seen as a problem, but rather as an enrichment. So there are also connections there. This lecture is part of De Brake's current project, which is a book intended for the same topic, or similar topic, or in line with the previous research, let me put it that way, intended for a broad audience. And the idea is to write an accessible book for a non-academic, non-specialized audience. And here he will do something that is quite special, namely, especially for early modern historians, I would say, is that he explicitly engages in connecting that period with the present. So we are very curious about that. About the seminar's structure, De Brake will talk for about 40-45 minutes. Then we will have a discussion of around 30 minutes moderated by me. And your attention, your efforts will be rewarded with drinks afterwards in this case. Please help me welcoming De Brake.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming out on this beautiful day. It's hard to miss the evidence that we are currently in the midst of a new age of religious war. If we think of religious wars as lethal conflicts, either civil or international, in which the combatants identify their enemies as well as their allies in terms of their religious beliefs, practices, or affiliations, then the evidence of religious war in the last 3 decades is abundant. For example, Christians versus Muslims in the Balkans and in Nigeria, Sunni versus Shia Muslims in the Middle East, and Buddhists versus Tamils or Muslims in South Asia. So should we consider these violent episodes of religious sectarianism and identity politics our new normal? Are we condemned to live in an unending cycle of religious violence and war? Amid deeply disturbing reports of military carnage and forced migration, it is much more difficult to imagine how these conflicts might end and what a more peaceful future might look like. This is not merely a problem of scarce evidence, however. It is also very clearly a problem of perception and imagination. We simply can't imagine a more peaceful future because we don't know what we're looking for. Neither can we recognize the things that make for peace, to borrow the language of the Gospel of Luke, which only those of you who are truly farsighted could probably read, if we attended only to the things that make for war. This is the problem I would like to discuss with you today. While concentrated clusters of religious conflict and violence like we see today are highly unusual, they are not unprecedented. In the 16th and 17th century, Europe was torn apart by a long series of increasingly destructive religious wars that I've been studying for nearly 2 decades. Using my historical research as my guide, I would like to advance 3 postulates regarding religious peace. First, religious peace is always possible. Secondly, religious peace is complex and messy. And third, religious peace is not free. But let me first say a few words about the religious background to the religious wars in Europe. In the 2 centuries between 1500 and 1700, the religious landscape of Europe was utterly transformed by a transnational process of religious fragmentation or pluralization that began with what we've traditionally referred to as the Reformation. Reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin sought to reform, let's see, which one do I push? That one. Religious reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin sought to reform the whole Western Christian church, which was under the authority of the popes in Rome. But they and their many followers quite unintentionally broke the previously unified church into an untold number of pieces. What remained of the original church came to be known as the Roman Catholic Church. Historians often use the term Protestant to designate the pieces of the church that broke away. But over time, the many different groups of Christians who protested against the old church had as many differences among themselves as they had with the old church. Some of their differences were theological in the sense that they believed different things about God and about themselves in relationship to God. But others were behavioral in the sense that they worshiped God differently and lived their lives according to different norms. Still pushing around. Oh, I'm not ready for that. Nor are you. The long-term consequences of this religious pluralization were theological, liturgical, and institutional. But the process itself was necessarily political, in the sense that it inevitably opened up questions about both religious and political authority. Who has the authority to decide what is appropriate and necessary in the realm of religious belief and practice? Who has the authority to implement or resist changes with regard to religious belief or liturgical practice on behalf of the whole community? In other words, the religious controversies that we associate with the theological challenges of Luther, Calvin, and many others became and remained politicized when a broad range of political actors chose sides in the religious debates. When various coalitions of actors mobilized and either promoted or resisted changes in the religious practice and the structure of religious authority, their actions were political, and by extension, their successes and failures were the result of a contentious political process. Now, for many people, these religious changes were at times bewildering and even frightening. But for religious and political authorities, the changes were especially problematic. Consequently, between the 1520s, when the process started, and the 1660s, when the cycle of controversy and conflict began to fade away, a wide variety of European political actors who had ready access to violent means, kings, princes, magistrates, militia leaders, or warlords, responded to the problems they associated with the process of religious change and fragmentation by deploying violence and the coordinated destruction of war. This graphic identifies the 6 major clusters of religious war in early modern Europe. What makes them religious wars is that the combatants identified both their enemies and their friends or allies in terms of their religious beliefs or affiliations. I realize that this graphic, which is a summary of 2 decades of research, is overwhelming and confusing at first blush. And don't worry, there won't be a quiz at the end before you get your drink. But I show it to you in order to make several essential points about religious peace, which is, after all, what I want to discuss. First of all, this graphic demonstrates that religious peace was possible even after the most destructive religious wars, like the 30 Years' War, which was the most destructive in European history before World War I. Negotiated settlements, which ended all but the last of these clusters, helped enormously to make peace possible. But the religious peace settlements rarely worked on the first try. Indeed, in France, the famous Edict of Nantes in 1598 was the 8th try, and it broke down and had to be reaffirmed 3 decades later. In 2 cases, however, the 80 Years' War and the British Civil Wars, there were no negotiated religious settlements, like the religious peace of Augsburg or the Edict of Nantes. In the Dutch case, it was a strictly political settlement that did not resolve the religious issues, that first paused a seemingly endless war in 1609 and ended it definitively as part of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. In the British Isles, the civil wars ended with the capture, trial, and execution of the king, the disestablishment of the Anglican Church, and the conquest of both Ireland and Scotland by Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the independent faction of the larger Puritan coalition in England. These decisive victories, something that the religious belligerents on the continent might have envied, did not, however, yield to either political or religious stability in any of the 3 kingdoms until the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688 brought a new political regime to all 3 kingdoms and opened up relatively secure places for religious dissenters, thus making religious peace possible. This graphic also suggests, in its right-hand column here, that the formula for a successful peace settlement was simple. Indeed, it was evident early on in the Landfrieden that ended the religious wars in Switzerland in 1531, and it was incorporated into all the treaties that followed. This formula included mutual recognition among competitive religious groups, security guarantees for all the signatories to the agreement, and mediation or legal processes to resolve future disagreements short of violence or war. So what was the difference between the peace treaties that lasted and those that didn't? Sometimes later agreements included provisions that demilitarized the competitive religious groups, but success always depended on the grudging consent of those who commanded the armies and had ready access to military force. This means, in many cases, that they had to accept the reality of religious diversity even though they wanted to restore unity and purity. For both religious and political leaders, accepting facts on the ground can be very difficult. Now, in broad outline, my very complex graphic tells this familiar story about early modern European history, even though I, of course, think it is far more nuanced and much more interesting than anything that has come before it. It is very much like what you might encounter in a standard history textbook in the sense that it is ruler-centered. And it is based on the kinds of historical sources that are found in official archives in the best research libraries. It is an account of what specialists in peace studies call negative peace, in the sense that it shows how the wars ended. But ruler-centered histories, like modern studies of negative peace, leave out at least half of the story. In fact, the formal peace treaties that Europe's rulers grudgingly consented to are at best aspirational, not descriptive of the facts on the ground. In order to see the rest of the story, we need to pay just as much attention to ordinary people, not just the rulers and their agents, but those who are at least nominally subject to their authority, their very diverse subjects. It is in their contentious interactions that we find the origins of what specialists call positive peace, that which makes real peace much more than the absence of war. This brings me finally to the heart of what I want to tell you today, that religious peace is very complex and messy because it is the work of many hands. In this half of the story, ordinary people are not the mere pawns or victims of powerful rulers, but they rather play very important roles as dissidents, subversives, and consequential historical actors. I believe the product of their historical interactions with often autocratic and intolerant rulers, I describe that product of their interactions as complex and messy, but it is not merely random. Please allow me to tell you a series of illustrative stories in order to show you what positive peace looks like. I'll begin in the East German city of Bautzen, near the modern borders of Germany, Poland, and the Czech Republic. Popular evangelical preachers first came to Bautzen in 1521, and a popular reform movement quickly persuaded the city council to declare for evangelical reform in 1524. In response, the official in charge of the Catholic cathedral in Bautzen, fearing for the welfare of his parishioners, should he lose control of St. Patrick's Cathedral, boldly invited the new evangelical community to share his beautiful worship space. With this, the evangelicals and Catholics of Bautzen began a long experiment in religious coexistence. By 1543, before religious war actually broke out in Germany, they had drawn up a formal contract to divide the church in the middle, where the nave takes a slight bend. I've put a line there. The front of the church, which is called the choir, with its side chapels, was reserved for Catholic worship, while the back of the church, the nave, was reserved for Protestant worship. Though the worship times have changed, this basic agreement remains in effect today. At first blush, sharing a sacred space, in German, a Simultankirche, or simultaneous church, might seem like a perfectly sensible and obvious solution to the problem of religious differentiation. In this case, however, it was also a profoundly subversive practice, since the immediate overlord of this territory was the Habsburg King of Bohemia, who was opposed to reform, while the hierarchy of the Catholic Church had forbidden strictly any compromise with heretics. But sharing sacred space was not the only mechanism by which evangelicals and Catholics managed their emergent religious differences in Bautzen and the surrounding territory of Upper Lusatia. As more and more rural communities committed to reform, evangelical reform, St. Peter's Cathedral represented a place of refuge, in the sense that rural Catholics could travel to the city to attend Catholic worship services. Again, traveling temporarily from one place to another in order to worship in the manner of one's choice, a practice the Germans called Auslauf, might seem like a perfectly sensible solution to the problem of religious diversity. But in a world where rulers claim the authority to determine the religious practices of their subjects, this too should be seen as a profoundly subversive act. Thus, the complex and messy relationships between evangelicals and Catholics in Bautzen in Upper Lusatia introduce us to two practices by which local rulers, competitive claimants to religious authority, and ordinary political subjects who chose different religious faiths could accommodate their religious differences. Over time, these practices proliferated throughout Europe because, like the principles of religious compromise built into the treaties, they were eminently modular or adaptable to a wide variety of circumstances. While St. Peter's Cathedral was one of the very first Simultankirche in Germany, shared churches proliferated simultaneously in Switzerland after the Landfrieden made inclusive religious peace possible. This village church in Oberhelfenschwil in the Swiss territory of Toggenburg, for example, was shared despite its ruler's specific prohibition of shared sacred spaces. In smaller churches like this one, Catholics typically had the exclusive use of the apse, where the altar was positioned, while the two congregations shared the body of the church. Note here that that there are two separate baptismal fonts, here and here, in the right front, which suggests that the two groups could not agree on a shared usage. Today, shared churches can still be found in many German cities, as well as village churches in Switzerland, the German Rhineland, and the region of Alsace, which the French acquired under the Peace of Westphalia. The practice of Auslauf, or commuting to another jurisdiction or community to worship freely, was even more widespread, though more difficult to document, since it was an informal and largely individual practice. We find a very different strategy for accommodating religious differences at work in the small village of Pingham in the northern Dutch province of Friesland. Behind the facade of this typical village house, there is a small Mennonite church that was constructed around 1600, which is for all practical purposes invisible or hidden. Inside, this modest worship space has the typical Mennonite arrangement with seating for women and children in the middle and men around the periphery. Descendants of the radical Anabaptists of the early Reformation, the followers of Menno Simons, were known as the peaceful Anabaptists. And in the course of the 80 Years' War, they became the largest Protestant network outside the public Reformed Church. Given the fact that this hidden church, what the Dutch call a schuilkerk, stands in close proximity to the official Reformed Church, it is clear that it was hidden only in the token sense, that it was made to look like something other than a house of worship. Indeed, this church is emblematic of the experience of a broad range of smaller Protestant groups that stood outside the official Reformed Church. Against the backdrop of violent repression under the Spanish regime, the dissenting Protestants apparently judged the necessity of keeping up the appearances of an exclusive public church was a reasonable trade-off, one that provided a measure of security that they had previously not enjoyed. By far the most famous schuilkerk in the Netherlands, is just a couple of blocks away, is an impressive church built into the top 3 stories of a large canal house in the center of Amsterdam. Known colloquially as Our Dear Lord in the Attic, this worship space was equipped with 2 galleries and an organ, and it could accommodate some 300 of the Catholic faithful. At the time it was built in the 1660s, it was just one of an estimated 60 small Catholic chapels that, much like the Mennonite church in Pingham, were hidden in the sense that they did not resemble a traditional house of worship. For the Catholic faithful, who remained more numerous than the official Reformed Protestants in many parts of the new Dutch Republic, it was undoubtedly a very painful experience to have to worship discreetly, in deference to the official public church. But adjust they did, as a wide variety of Dutch rulers, competitive claimants to God's authority, and their frequently dissenting subjects all learned how to accommodate the religious differences. Consequently, the Dutch Republic became a model of peaceful and durable religious diversity in a war-torn Europe. Nominally hidden churches, like shared churches, were a common sense and modular mechanism for accommodating deeply held and often contentious religious differences. Like Auslauf, the practice of worshiping discreetly in order to keep up the appearance of dominance and stay out of trouble, could be adapted to a variety of settings. In these cases, behind the facade of official tolerance, one finds more diverse realities on the ground. There were, however, also a broad range of situations where merely keeping up appearances was out of the question, because the official exclusionary policies of rulers were backed up with active enforcement of heresy or conformity laws. These included prominently the city-states of Zurich and Bern in the Swiss Confederation, where the Swiss Brethren, the religious cousins of the Dutch Mennonites, were actively hunted, prosecuted, and sometimes executed. The southern Netherlands, roughly the territory of modern Belgium, where the exclusive restoration of the Catholic Church was backed up by inquisitorial courts that actively pursued Calvinists and Mennonite heretics, at least for a time. And the Kingdom of Ireland, where a Protestant minority actively persecuted and ordered the vast majority who chose to remain Catholic to move to the barren western periphery in Connaught, especially under the Commonwealth. In none of these cases, it is important to note, was the attempted elimination of religious difference actually successful. In these cases, religious dissenters, that is, subjects who stubbornly refused to conform to those rulers' claim to religious sovereignty, survived because of a different set of mechanisms, the most important of which were secrecy and dissimulation. But the very act of worshiping in secret and under the pretense of conformity means that this form of coexistence is also difficult to find in the historical record. Still, historians and even intrepid tourists like my wife Nelva and I, who use Google searches to go beyond the limited documentary evidence of libraries and official government archives, can find material tokens of the survival of religious diversity in each of these cases. Take, for example, the secret hiding place for Anabaptist preachers that is built into the hayloft of this farmstead in the Swiss Emmental near Bern. Or this modest Protestant historical museum near the small village of Sint Maria Horebeke in Flanders that collects material and documentary evidence of the continuous existence of active Calvinist churches in the southern Netherlands from the 1560s to the present day. Or this informal worship site, often called a mass rock, where the Catholic faithful of the Irish village of Tom Haggard in County Wexford worshipped following the destruction of their village church by Oliver Cromwell's army in 1649. All of these sites, and many more like them, bear eloquent witness to the determined dissenters, Catholic as well as Protestant, who made religious choices that defied the wishes of their more powerful political and spiritual rulers, despite the perils of active persecution. One other strategy that reflects official adaptation to changing or intractable circumstances is especially evident in England, where the religious landscape is still dotted with a wide variety of nonconformist chapels and meeting houses. During the English Civil Wars, the official monopoly of the Anglican Church was broken. And under the Revolutionary Commonwealth, a very robust religious marketplace opened up, most famously in London. Though the Anglican Church was restored in 1660, its religious monopoly was never effectively reestablished under the Restoration. Thus, the nonconformists and dissenters who worshipped openly during the Commonwealth were required to worship clandestinely under the Restoration. But many of them were licensed on a case-by-case basis to worship openly following the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Among these were the Independents of Walpole in East Anglia, who worshipped in this converted barn, and the Quakers of Burford, who worshipped in this purpose-built meeting house west of Oxford. By now, I hope I have demonstrated that the religious peace that emerged in post-Reformation was the work of many hands, in the sense that a wide variety of religious dissenters defied the often authoritarian claims of their rulers and the religious authorities who were allied with them. The hallmark of this religious peace was a limited set of different forms of religious coexistence, all of which emerged from the interactions of ordinary people with those who claimed authority over them. What is remarkable is that these facts on the ground were in place before the religious wars ended, and in many cases before the wars even started. And although many European rulers insisted that they had the authority to decide what their subjects should believe and how they should worship the divine, their subjects proved over and over that official intolerance and often violent repression would not be the end of the story. Religious peace was complex and messy, to be sure, but it was not random. Indeed, it is important to recognize that there was a clearly delimited range of variation, which I have tried to capture in this conceptual map. As I see it, there are two principal dimensions in this variation. In the official policies of particular regimes, ranging from exclusive to inclusive of religious diversity, the horizontal dimension. And in the visibility and thus salience of clearly different religious identities in public life, the vertical dimension. In this array, then, I consider Bautzen an example of parity, where evangelicals and Catholics shared St. Peter's Cathedral on equal terms, regardless of the relative size of the two groups, whereas I consider Upper Lusatia, more generally, an example of privilege, where the evangelical or Lutheran church became the exclusive official church and dissenting Catholic practiced Auslauf and traveled to Bautzen to worship freely. Meanwhile, I have located Oberhelfenschwil with its Simultankirche on the exclusive side of the figure, somewhere between privilege and repression, depending on how seriously its overlord enforced his ban on Protestant worship. Both the Mennonite Church in Pinium and the Catholic Church in Amsterdam are emblematic of the officially exclusive privilege of the public Reformed Church in the Dutch Republic. By contrast, the Protestant Historical Museum in St. Maria Horebeke, the hiding place for illegal pastors in the Emmental, and the Mass Rock in Tom Haggard are emblematic of the survival of religious diversity under active repression. In the middle of this figure, I have located the Independents of Walpole and the Quakers of Burford as examples of what I call ad hoc tolerance, by which specific groups are granted formal exceptions to otherwise exclusionary rules by their rulers. In the lower right of this map, I have located the whole of France as an example of integration. Indeed, under the Edict of Nantes, the Protestant Huguenots acquired only limited opportunities for visible public worship, but they were guaranteed equal civil and political rights alongside their Catholic adversaries. In other words, the Edict of Nantes and its 7 predecessors was formally inclusive of religious diversity at the same time as it limited the salience or visibility of religious differences, religious identities in public life. Unfortunately, I cannot give you visual tokens of this extraordinary experiment because the most obvious tokens of religious diversity in France after 1598, the purpose-built temples that the Huguenots were able to build and consecrate for their reformed style of worship, were systematically destroyed nearly a century later as Louis XIV moved toward formal repudiation of the inclusive policies that his grandfather, Henry IV, had used to make peace possible in a deeply divided and depleted kingdom. Altogether, this array, which includes all the examples I have treated in my book, describes the range of variation that historians have found in post-Reformation Europe. In most polities, we find a mixture of these varied relationships between diverse subjects and their political and spiritual rulers. Indeed, it's the admixture of these different forms that makes the facts of religious diversity so complex and messy. But it may also be obvious that none of the variable forms that I have described and accounted for was necessarily ideal or perfect. On the contrary, it is critically important to recognize that while religious peace is always better than religious war, it is not free. In fact, it can be quite costly. Now, using my conceptual map as a guide, let me offer a quick cost-benefit analysis based on European experience. Let me begin in the lower left in the realm of repression. There, the costs of survival and perseverance might seem to preclude regarding this as a form of peaceful coexistence, as my students often argued against me. Still, repression was a recurrent theme in all of the phases of religious war that I have studied, and given the fact that active repression failed everywhere to eliminate religious diversity, it did turn out to be a durable form of religious peace. In this case, it is especially important to note that the costs of active repression are high for both the intolerant rulers and their dissenting subjects. Indeed, as a short-term strategy of domination, active repression could cripple economies, cause large-scale forced migrations, both of which undermine the legitimacy and efficacy of authoritarian rule. As a long-term relationship, however, the combination of public domination and secretive survival could offer subtle benefits to religious nonconformists that partially offset the cost of secrecy and dissimulation to avoid trouble. Indeed, it is under the conditions of active repression that one discovers the enormous spiritual ingenuity, improvisation, and courage that often worried religious authorities in places like the Swiss Emmental, the southern Netherlands, and Ireland, and at the same time empowered ordinary religious dissenters, especially women, as educators within the household and the secret faith community. In the lower right of my diagram, in the realm of integration, the benefits of religious peace may seem more obvious while the costs would seem to be negligible. Still, the extraordinary case of France illustrates the trade-offs when this official policy is inclusive. But full integration limits the visibility and salience of religious identities in public life. Now, for the French Huguenots, reintegration into civil and political life may have seemed ideal after the deep estrangement and violence of the recurrent wars. But when it was paired with serious limits on the publicity of their religious practices, even when it was paired with the serious limits on the publicity of their religious practices. But for French Catholics, as opposed to Dutch or Irish Catholics, any restrictions on the publicity of their ritual processions and feast days seemed to be anathema. After all, for devout Catholics, tradition seemed to demand that their faith and ritual practices be a demonstrative and salient feature of the civic community. In the upper right, parity seems like a common-sense modular practice that allows multiple competitive and often contentious faith communities to be visible and salient features of the civic community. It certainly proved to be a durable practice in the sharing of St. Peter's Cathedral in Bautzen, but other churches and communities where the parity principle was used to accommodate differences, the complex rules that govern the sharing of sacred and civic space could become rigidly inflexible and inhibit adaptation to changing circumstances. In the upper left of my diagram, privilege institutionalizes the domination of one confession or faith community over all others. In the absence of active repression, it was probably the most common form of religious coexistence we find in early modern Europe, in the constituent territories of the German Empire and the Swiss Confederation, as well as in the Dutch Republic and the Kingdom of England, in which very vibrant, visible, and durable patterns of religious diversity became embedded in political, legal, and cultural institutions. For those who might otherwise have been subjected to active persecution, this form of exclusion might have seemed like a reasonable bargain in the short term. But like all forms of exclusion based on religious beliefs, practices, or affiliations, the inequalities of confessional privilege become durable and often intractable, because over time they coincide with other forms of inequality, like unequal access to public welfare, education, certain professions or vocations, and even residential segregation. These durable inequalities become particularly problematic when they are seen as profoundly unjust by later generations. In the middle of my diagram, or my map, my conceptual map, ad hoc tolerance, which grants specific exemptions to otherwise generally operative rules of exclusion, came to be a very prominent feature of the religious peace in Europe. It was a pragmatic political practice, as opposed to an ideological conviction, by which officially intolerant rulers could step back from the harshest consequences of their exclusionary policies, give relief to worthy dissenters, and thereby reduce the economic and social consequences of their own intolerance. At first blush, ad hoc tolerance may have seemed like a win-win practice. But these partial exemptions from the disabilities of subordination do not undo the larger nexus of durable inequalities that exclusion gives rise to. What's more, ad hoc exceptions are always and forever vulnerable to revocation by the sovereign who granted them. So, what difference does all this historical variation make? How can we possibly learn anything useful from the experience of religious conflict and coexistence that occurred hundreds of years ago? To be sure, the history of post-Reformation Europe will not simply be repeated today in the Middle East, Africa, South Asia, or even Europe and North America. But there are important perceptual and analytic cues that we can learn from this kind of broadly comparative history. By looking for the variable and imperfect tokens of religious coexistence that surround us today, and by recognizing the mechanisms and processes that brought them into being, we can envision realistically what a peaceful religious future might look like, and what might be required to bring it into being. Let me start with the tokens of religious peace. Durable forms of religious coexistence are all around us. We just have to learn to recognize them when we see them. Here, for example, are some of the modern recurrences that I think are readily visible in the world around us. Let me give you a few moments to see if you share my recognition. I see, for example, repression in Myanmar, in Iraq, integration in France, Turkey, and the United States, parity in Lebanon and Bosnia, privilege in both Saudi Arabia and Iran, and ad hoc tolerance in polities that license some faith communities or sects, but not others. Of course, This kind of global perspective obscures much of the complexity and messiness of religious coexistence in the 21st century. In the United States, for example, the first Constitution, which was clearly informed by the history we have been looking at, provides that no particular religious group will be established, and that all religious groups are to worship freely. We can obviously call this an inclusive regime. This means that in urban and even suburban settings, we typically live within easy walking distance of very diverse places of worship. Like we saw in early modern Europe, some of these spaces might even be shared, sometimes for practical reasons, sometimes as a matter of principle. If we look very closely, however, we will see that some of these sacred spaces are more visible and respectable than others. Some are barely recognizable as places of worship, much like the Schuilkerken, the nominally hidden churches of the Dutch Republic. Most modern democracies are formally inclusive, but like the United States, not all religious groups are equally visible or acceptable. In some officially inclusive polities, like Germany, Canada, and France, groups like Scientologists are denied official recognition. Even autocratic states like China may be officially inclusive of multiple faith communities, though at the same time they exclude and repress others. Many other countries, including some democracies, have officially established religions, which are privileged over other groups. These we can call exclusive regimes. In democracies like the United Kingdom, Ireland, and the Netherlands, established churches coexist with a broad range of other faith communities, and their differences are barely visible anymore in public life. In autocratic regimes with established religions like Saudi Arabia and Iran, the privileged groups might seem monolithic. Let's see. I just lost my space. The privileged groups might seem monolithic, like the regimes that sought to project unity and purity in early modern Europe. Still, such regimes typically include sizable and very diverse religious minorities that are not persecuted as long as they accept their subordinate status and keep a low profile. In other officially exclusive regimes, some religious minorities are actively persecuted, like the Rohingya Muslims of officially Buddhist and nominally democratic Myanmar, or the Yazidis under the apologetically militant Islamic State in Iraq. Even in these extreme cases, however, when the costly persecution survives, as it always did in early modern Europe, the persecuted do survive, deploying the recurrent mechanisms of secrecy and dissimulation to stay out of trouble. All of these regimes incorporate more than one common form of religious coexistence, which is why religious peace is so complex and messy, even in the absence of war. The essential point is not whether I'm right or wrong in characterizing these specific instances at this particular moment in history. Rather, the point is that when we actually look for recurrent patterns, which are readily visible even in the midst of war, and we remember that these patterns combine differently in a variety of contexts, we can also begin to imagine more realistically how the often troubling situations we encounter today are part of a larger historical process, one that will likely lead to a bounded set of imperfect yet durable outcomes that we can recognize as positive religious peace. But how does this historical process move? What are the things that will make for peace in the 21st century? Let's start by reviewing the things that made for peace in early modern Europe. We can use the term mechanisms to denote a delimited class of events or interactions that alter the relations among historical actors in identical or closely similar ways across a variety of situations. Processes, by extension, are clusters or concatenations of mechanisms that recurrently alter the relations of historical actors over longer periods of time and in a variety of situations with a limited range of variant outcomes. Now, you may have noticed that I have already introduced a range of mechanisms that I think help to bring Europe's religious wars to an end and serve to shape diversity. Rulers made negative peace possible when they ended the coordinated destruction of war by means of mutual recognition, security guarantees, and mediation, demilitarization of religious factions, and even in some cases, by military victory. Ordinary people helped to create durable forms of religious coexistence in variable circumstances, often in defiance of political and religious authorities who sought unity and purity by sharing sacred spaces, by practicing auslav, through secrecy and dissimulation, and by achieving ad hoc tolerance. These mechanisms are modular in the sense that they always have the same effect, and they can be adapted to a wide variety of circumstances. When we recognize them at work in the midst of violence and war, we can know that we are not stuck where we are at present. And we can even imagine where we might be going in the future. Now, at first blush, these two lists of mechanisms might seem to be worlds apart, inasmuch as they affected the relations among very different groups of actors and operated at very different scales of political integration. That is, national and international elites and their agents, as opposed to local rulers, competitive claimants, competitive religious authorities, and contentious faith communities. Still, they have a great deal in common. Most important, they operated simultaneously rather than sequentially, prior to, during, and in the aftermath of Europe's religious wars. Thus, their effects were interdependent and continuously interactive. As I see it, both sets of actors and both sets of mechanisms were part of a larger religious peacemaking process that produced a very pervasive pattern of religious coexistence that constituted, in turn, the foundations for modern religious pluralism. Indeed, in my broadly comparative work, I have condensed these into 4 mechanisms with less historically specific names that in various concatenations made religious peace possible in early modern Europe. The first is negotiation. Both formal and informal, local and national, can lead to mutual recognition, security guarantees, and provisions for nonviolent resolution of future disputes. Think not only of the famous edicts and treaties, but also the local agreements to share sacred spaces. Segregation, political, social, or physical, can reduce the likelihood of violent encounters and or disrupt coalitions, including violent specialists, that enable violent conflict. Think of practices like auslav, as well as the agreements that demilitarize the rival religious parties, separating religious leaders and faith communities from specialists in coercion. Domination, political or military, can bring order to otherwise violent or chaotic situations. Think of Oliver Cromwell's victories in England, Ireland, and Scotland, or the implicit agreement in the First Treaty of Munster that validated Catholic restoration in the southern Netherlands and the Reformed Church's public exclusivity in the Dutch Republic. But perhaps the most important, subversion can open up spaces for diversity where formal agreement or domination would seem to exclude them. Think of Anabaptists or Mennonites nearly everywhere, Catholics in the British Isles and the Dutch republics, or Calvinists in the southern Netherlands or France. Although I do not claim that this array of mechanisms is either exhaustive or definitive, indeed I am open to suggestions for improvement, I am quite certain that these are prominent among the things that make for religious peace. Therefore, if we proactively look for and recognize dynamic mechanisms like this when we see them at work, we will become better analysts of the myriad conflicts that surround us today. Indeed, recognizing recurrently operative mechanisms will help us to discern where we are situated within the larger historical processes of making religious peace or accommodating religious differences in a religiously polarized and recurrently violent world. By extension, in order to envision what a more peaceful future might look like in an active war zone, we need especially to explore the history of religious coexistence that preceded the war and the practices that survived during the war. After all, as was evident in European history, the signatories to successful peace treaties recurrently, if begrudgingly, accept the facts of diversity on the ground as the foundation for peace. In the end, then, historical recognition can help us to understand that we are not simply stuck where we are today. That the dreadful ubiquity of religious conflict in this new century is not an unprecedented and entirely new normal. And that religious hatred, bigotry, and intolerance will not prevail in the long run. Now, for most of us, promoting international peace and stopping war will seem hopelessly beyond our reach. But, as we have seen, stopping war is only half of the story. It also takes ordinary people who resist the demands of often intolerant rulers to shape and sustain a durable peace. In addition, European history teaches us that all religious peace settlements are likely to be imperfect and fragile, including the ones that are embedded in modern constitutions. This is because times change, and the compromises that were acceptable to one generation might look unjust and unbearable costs to their descendants. The ongoing challenge for religious peacemakers, then, is to identify and seek redress for injustices in order to preserve religious peace for everyone. For without peace, there can be no justice. But without justice, no peace can last. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for the conceptual lessons, which can be much more broadly applicable than the historical period. We have about 15 minutes for questions.